Good morning.
Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning. So we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Celia Eberle, who is joining us from her studio in Ennis, and to present the Artist's Eye program this morning. You can ask questions through the Q&A function. We don't have the chat going, but please do throughout the program put in questions, and we'll try to get them to them at the end of the program. So I'll begin with a few words of introduction to Celia. She is, as I said, in her studio in Ennis. She's actually grew up in East Texas in Longview, and she calls that she's from the Pine Curtain in the East, but she's been a part of the arts community in Dallas for a long time, having made that commute for some time from Longview, also sometimes to Houston, before moving closer to Dallas. I'm also really happy to say that her exhibition, The Reanimation Project at Chris Worley Fine Arts in Dallas, has been extended. So it would have closed earlier in the month, and it's been extended through May 29th, which gives, if you haven't seen the show, it gives you an opportunity to do so. Wonderful show. Broadly speaking, it addresses the fears and potential consequences of the rise of artificial intelligence. And Celia's going to talk about several of those objects along with others in our talk today. She frequently exhibits at Chris Worley. You can check out their website as well as Celia's own to catch up with her work. She had a mid-career retrospective called In the Garden of Ozymandias at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas in Beaumont in 2014. And I'd also mention that recently she's won several really prestigious grants, including one from the Adolf and Esther Gottlieb Foundation, as well as a grant from the Joan Mitchell Foundation. And her work is exhibited and collected extensively throughout Texas. Celia's work is very rich, and it's really it's something that's steeped in mythology, in paradox. She explores what I'll call sort of the big things like love and dystopia and the past and the future and so on. And I wanted to read a statement that she wrote that I think is very eloquent and succinct and sort of addressing some of the things that her art is about, because she says it better than I would be able to myself. She wrote, "It's my observation that we humans have very little understanding of ourselves. I believe that in spite of our constantly evolving technology, we've advanced very little since we started inventing the myths, stories, and histories that we use to explain our circumstances. The stories and their attendant imagery persist throughout time and retain their attraction because they remain true. I've spent many years exploring this conundrum, as I find it both fascinating and alarming. I've used many mediums and approaches to tackle this core issue." And this is one of the things that we'll see today, is that although we could characterize Celia's art as really conceptual, it's very much about the object and what she does. There's such a range in her work in terms of the material that's used, the craft, the skies and the size and so on. But throughout, there's a really exquisite sort of craftsmanship. that invites you to sort of explore different layers of the work. Well, let's turn the program over to Celia. And what we want to do today is to talk about, Celia selected 5 objects from the Kimbell. So the whole idea of the Artist's Eye program is that we invite an artist who shares with us their insights. We want to see what their sort of see the objects through their eyes and see how they resonate with them. Most of the objects she chosen are actually female figures and of sculptures, and somehow they're agents of power and forces of nature and vessels of technology, all of which are themes in her work. So we're going to go back to PowerPoint. And the first sculpture that we're looking at, I was really delighted that that Celia chose this work because some of you may not be familiar with it because of its location. It's in what we call the Blue Courtyard, beautiful courtyard with a fountain in the Consouth galleries. And it's a work that has been with the collection, from the beginning. It's by the sculptor Antoine Bourdelle, who actually worked with Rodin as his praticien. In other words, he executed many of his works. He blocked out and worked the marbles and so on, but throughout that time produced his own work and sort of went out on his own. And he's one of the artists during that time who really embraced figural art, as opposed to total abstraction. But certainly there are really interesting things that he does with the figure. The subject is Penelope, and so it deals with that great myth. And Celia, I'd love you to talk about just why you chose this work, your perceptions of it, and how he tackled that story, that myth.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I appreciate the introduction and appreciate the opportunity to work with you on this. So one of the eternal themes that interests me is the condition of women and their traditional association with nature. So Homer has Odysseus return to his home and his family, and I think that Homer has him making a choice between chaos and order, and that order that he has him choose is the basis of civilization, the family, and the woman as the very structure of home and order, like the caryatid that she resembles. If we could look at her bare foot next. I wanted to make this comparison between her and Barefoot and Pregnant, which is from a body of work that I called Mother F, where I'm thinking about the traditional idea of Mother Earth as female and comparing the situation of the Earth as a polluted planet to that of an abused woman, and just exploring the uses and abuses of both nature and women. And so this piece is made out of stacked newsprint, which is paper pulp. And if the foot were an actual full-size statue, it would be about 40 feet tall, which is the height of a tree when it's ready to pulp for paper. So the title refers to something that I heard when I was growing up. It was barefoot and pregnant was a way that a man might keep his wife at home. She can see if she had no shoes and she was constantly pregnant, she would have a hard time getting around. I don't know why Bordell chose to give Penelope a barefoot. I don't know if it was an aesthetic choice or what his reasoning was, but I found it interesting and I thought it was an excellent way to compare the two works.
I love this comparison in a lot of ways, because this whole idea of woman is Mother Earth and nature, and someone who is very strong and carries a lot of weight. There's so much strength in the way that Bordell's representing Penelope here, with those giant arms and the lower body and so on, that column that you referred to. And then in your work too, it's as though all the weight has come down and compressed to this giant, wonderful foot. And I think Bordell was thinking about scale too. He worked this, first in a smaller version, about 17 inches, and then ours is about 4 feet tall, if you're thinking about square. And then several years later, he made one that's 8 feet tall. So obviously he was thinking about those things too. But I love the formal qualities. Celia, when we were looking at this, you remarked about it too. You build this wonderful surface with these striations and so on, and this is an example, using in this case, humble materials, but there's a real beauty, especially that comes out at the edges, I think, of the work that I really enjoy.
We were talking about the horizontal texture and the vertical texture, how similar they were to each other, which I thought was interesting. So I think we have a slide of her foot that we could go to. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So here again, I don't know what Bordell was thinking about particularly with the barefoot, but it sort of speaks to her condition and sort of the sense of resignation that she sort of evokes, like resignation in her face and in her stance. It's like, this is the condition that she's in and she is resigned to it.
Yeah, there's a lovely sort of S curve that I suppose the foot brings out. And this is a really telling kind of side by side. Tell me what's going on here.
Okay, this is a piece from the mythology of love, and so I've equated the altar of sacrifice with the altar of marriage. And I was thinking about the fact that true love requires sacrificing part of yourself. As the song says, the love you take is equal to the love you make. And the irony of the fact is that you would use the perfume in a way that your ego requires you to find a mate, but at the same time, that ego is part of what you will have to give up once you find a relationship.
And the ceramic is a material that Celia uses often, and to wonderful effect. The perfume quality too. Do you want to talk about the perfume just for a second, because it's
I decided
a
to.
lot of fun, and that this is part of what I love about Celia's work, because heavy subjects, but sometimes you have high-low things or something that just kind of grabs our attention and says something in another way that stops us in our tracks.
Well, I try to be humorous as well as ironic, and I think irony just comes naturally in a way, because when you start juxtaposing these things, the irony just happens. But I wanted to make perfume myself, so I started researching and buying, the basics for the fragrances and things, and it's a fairly complicated process. And so I decided I wanted to make 4 scents that I would, title L, O, V, and E, not to be too obvious. And I discovered that as I made them, that I was actually creating what is the standard 4 basic perfume scents that is has been made since they started making perfume, which is the floral and the woodsy, the mysterious, and the citrus or fresh flavor scent. So that's what I happen to create, and people like it. They're fairly faint. They're not real robust. I actually went to the effort of finding some ambergris online, and I used that traditional material to provide the staying power that the scent requires, and that has made them very soft and um, easily accepted, I think, by people who are offended by stronger scents. Um,
Well, it's interesting the fact that there are actual scents that were great, and it's indicative of your work that you dive into it wholeheartedly and take on something, totally different. But I find when I spend time with your work, often it goes back to things that are quite universal, like, as you said, these scents. Really, you just intuitively came upon something that is traditional, and that's the fun thing about the Artist Eye program too. So an artwork that we might consider, although in his own time Bourdelle was doing something sort of revolutionary, and from the same, you exhibited this in the same show, the mythology of love, and again, actually a perfume holder. You might receptacle not catch on right away, and most people will get the reference here. This is a really wonderful piece, Celia.
oh, thank you.
And I love the juxtaposition too of these two, the bronze and then the silvered, and something that is in this case, we're moving into robotics.
Right. So this piece is an oversized perfume bottle, and I thought that sort of symbolized outsized desire, and I wanted to compare that idea of outsized desire with the idea from the film Metropolis, which was created in 1927. So I used the image of the robot's face, and that film is sort of a modern myth about love and power and control. And this robot was created to sort of contain and direct all desire and to give its creator power.
When you chose this, were you? There's that famous line from the movie: the mediator between the head and the hands must be the heart. I'm assuming that was a real reference for your thinking. I think this is a really brilliant way of just touching on dystopia and those issues.
Yeah, almost all of our dystopian stories contain some form of love story. And it, I think if we don't believe that love is the answer, we at least believe it's a light in the dark.
Mhm. Interesting. Yeah. Well, let's move on to the next, and we'll come back to the Love Machine, which has this lovely title too, talking from the song. The next work you wanted to look at was a Parvati, an Indian sculpture from the 15th century that shows this archetypical female figure. So please talk
She's a
about it.
mother
Yeah.
goddess. Yes, she's a mother goddess, and she's meant to personify fertility and maternity. And the Indian ideals of feminine beauty. So her appearance is completely inspired by nature. Her arms are meant to resemble bamboo shoots, and her eyes are modeled after the lotus petal or the fish. So her very form takes its shape from nature. Um, so I think with comparing her to the love machine across cultures and across time, we have this concept of an ideal female as a vessel of desire. Um, so in the movie, the woman the robot takes its identity from is motherly and compassionate, but the robot itself is made to be purely sexual and avaricious. So it's a form of manipulation, manipulating what should have been a um, pure and idyllic experience into something uh, to be used as a form of power.
Mm-hmm. Now the looking at these formally too, and the Indian work is just so incredible in terms of sculptural volume and volumes that speak to the sensuality of that that figure. Yours is really tactile as well, and I'm struck by the sort of the helmet form that you is in around surrounding the head of the love machine, and then actually rather similar form with this wonderful comb.
No, that's purely coincidental,
Mm-mm.
because I actually took the form of the helmet from the movie.
Literally from it, yeah.
And so the comb represents the idealization of the body through decoration. And decorating the body may be one of the earliest art forms. So I kept the shell intact to remind us that nature is the original source of the decoration. And I think of the comb as sort of a symbol for the mind. So comparing those two things, the earliest form of art and self-decoration, I'm thinking about the mind as and its evolution toward self-awareness.
Well, formally coincidental or not, when I looked at this, I was thinking of skulls and brains and shields, and I mean the work really resonates, and then again just so beautifully crafted with the way that these sharp prongs have been made. It's a really beautiful piece. So another comparison with the, want to tell us about this
So,
group?
so Pavarti is an object of worship. I mean, she is uh, a figure, a created figure that's an object of worship. And I wanted to show a kind of worshipful appreciation for this beautiful bug. Um, and so I put it on a table, and when you approach the table, it plays um, the cicada song, which I actually recorded some cicadas, and then I had a musician take my recordings and clean them up and kind of give them a more regular cadence. And so I'm exploring the cycles of nature, which we are tied to, and preciousness, and a fanciful approach to nature, which is reflected in the Parvati, and nature as decoration. I mean, I've laid her out on a table so that she's more of a decorative aspect with her cohorts are on the wall, and
Mhm.
um, the idea of decoration and its closeness to art, its proximity to art.
Up close again, yeah, that I was, Till and I were talking because the cicada has such power. I've experienced one of those 17-year binges of, and the sound can just be deafening, when you have huge swarms of them. And the whole notion of what they represent in their life cycle and so on. So again, just sort of brilliant choice of the subject and how they're executed and displayed and so on. Well, from this to our next, it seems like it's a natural leap in a way. So we're looking at Miro's woman addressing the public, and a woman she is, a monumental woman. She is, the Kimbell's lucky enough to have, we actually have 3 works by Miro, and this late work, one of his last, really greets the viewer. We have an early portrait, and also one of his iconic gouaches from the Constellation series that shows that sort of his particular surrealist character. But just a word about his intentions here. The title comes from, he was working with smaller maquettes and drawings and so on, and wrote down this title, Woman Addressing the Public, because he initially intended it to be for LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and that project fell through. Then he wanted it to be in Central Park in a children's playground, and then there were some initial discussions with the Hirshhorn, and finally it was cast, and cast during his lifetime in bronze. He sort of changed the materials, but Celia, I'm really interested in your, seeing these alongside, and they're just sort of fun formally. They're always fun formally, but just in terms of how Miro's tackling, Mother Nature, woman, and so on.
Yeah, I think he was exploring the conflict between the impulsive subconscious and the conscious intellectual mind, and I think that could again be expressed as chaos versus order. And he's assigning animal characteristics to a human, and I've sort of assigned some human characteristics to an animal. actually an insect, but I think that makes an interesting comparison. The subconscious mind and um, we don't even really know if there is much difference between the conscious and the subconscious. Um, there's still a lot that we don't understand about the human mind. And I had been lumping psychology in with mythology because it's not really a hard science, but they're trying to make it harder science because they're trying to meld it with brain science. And so they will probably actually make it a hard science soon. But I think it's very interesting where we're going with those studies. But I just wonder if that will help us to consciously evolve any further than we already have.
This is lovely, showing the prone one with all that detail in the work. You define, I mean, the whole notion of chaos and order and how we deal with that and move forward is something that you address and readdress.
Yes, it's a
Yeah,
constant preoccupation, I would say.
yeah.
Um, so moving on with our thoughts about the mind, I, the use of a nest, a wasp nest image originated with a very large nest that I created. It was about 5 feet across, and I called it the mind of God. And I felt that it related to chaos theory. Chaos theory is it's stated that whatever appears chaotic is actually part of a larger order that we can't see, or else things that are actually chaotic evolve to an order, like smoke dissipating into the air. Um, so I felt that wasps build order from chaos by taking their materials from the wider world and creating this sort of geometric architectural form that composed the nest. And I thought that being able to perceive order in the world was perhaps the origin of the perception of God as a larger mind that controls everything.
Just another view. So I wanted to point out, this idea of I wanted to point out how beautifully made these are. The side view allows you see a little bit how you've meticulously and painstakingly carved this out of bone. We can see from the edges, sort of very fragile, but very believable too. And there's something about these objects that just as the craft of them, the making of them. And I was curious, I haven't really asked you about this before, how you perceive yourself as an artist fitting into this scheme of things. If there is the God, the maker, and the chaos and so on, what you see your role as an artist.
I don't know. I haven't considered that question.
Yeah. Well, you're calling attention to
Yeah,
those issues. I think you're well.
I think it seems pretty lame to me to only call attention and point to things. I'm not sure that that's enough in the world that we live in to just call attention and point to things. But I go back to this theory that I had in the beginning. The only explanation I have for making things or for being an artist is that I'm like a weed. I'm here. This is what I do. So, and that's kind of that I realized belatedly. That's like Hegel or Heidegger. I'm not sure which one. It's just that this is just how I am, and this is what I do.
Mhm. Wow.
And
That's a down to earth and honest and modest response to all of it, humbled in the face of nature. I would say, but yeah, looking at these again, just your choices of things and the message that bone carries within itself. You sometimes use teeth,
yes,
and other things that refer to, well, the materials that carry meaning within themselves, whether you subvert them or bring that out, they're there. And if we pause long enough, I think we start to notice those things. I think the more time I spend. So we've talked too about how either it's that preciousness and this aspect that you're creating these in a way reliquaries for meaning. That's something that the artist does. So I'm sorry, got ahead of myself. Spectre?
yeah. So these are bone also. So I'll talk a little more about bone as a bearer of meaning. Um, it represents life and the cycle of life and death. Um, I think it's one of the earliest materials for making tools and adornments. And it's a substitute for ivory. So it has sort of a precious quality to it. Um, and I think it could be a symbol of plenty or a symbol of starvation. So I think it has a lot of important qualities, and I love using it for that reason. And I think that I'm just trying to emphasize the cycles of nature that we are, we are trapped in these cycles and we don't fully understand them or appreciate them for what they are. And I think it's important that we do appreciate these things that we don't fully understand.
It's a lovely piece, and we see how differently you've crafted these to, in this case, show that ephemeral nature, the way the wings are so fragile, though the material's quite strong. It's a lovely piece. The next, Mayo's Lair. This was a work that he made. It was initially, the initial work was commissioned by the city of Toulouse to honor the crew of the hydroplanes, or the pilots, actually the pilots that died in service, who were piloting those transatlantic, from between the mail service between France and South America, and lost their lives, during the course of those missions, terribly dangerous at the time. So it's interesting that he chose. I mean, for Mayo, that was really his theme, was the female nude, and how he chose to depict it.
Yeah. So he's using woman as a mythical representation of a force of nature. And in this case, it's nature in service to technology. It's dominating nature. And the success of the airmail was, like one of the heights of a technological achievement at that time. And we also didn't understand at that time what the consequences of air travel and the amount of air travel that we were about to experience in the world, the sort of pollution that goes along with that and what it has done for us. So almost nothing is without consequence of some sort. But we just barrel along. We just keep doing it. So I had these pieces of wood on my property. They were fallen trees. They had started to decay, and I'd been looking at these pieces of wood for a while, and I loved the patterns in them and thought that they were really interesting, and even the natural color of it. But well, and also the sort of swirling patterns reminded me of Van Gogh's Starry Night. So I wanted to use them in some way, and I just put sort of a thin wash of alkyd and oil on these pieces, sort of to bring out the color that I wanted to, especially with the white ones. I let as much of the natural shade come through as possible. I felt that they just looked like sky, like a setting sun, or in the case of the blue ones, the really dark, forbidding sky, and the darkness that comes from polluted sky. I just felt that that was sort of an interesting combination. The tree depends on the sky, and so do we. So
it makes the point really eloquently, and at the same time, showing those dangers that you've pointed out. And I love just seeing these two, side by side.
Yeah, I like the horizontal aspect of it. I think it's interesting that the host choice pose for her is very dramatic. And here we are again with the texture and the linearity rhyming between my piece and Kimbell's piece.
This idea of floating, but at the same time being so stolid and heavy, and so on.
So this piece, it represents a pool full of koi, and they're left to struggle on this rusty ledge. The koi are precious, valuable fish that we really care about. And, they're going to suffer too from, the predations of our activities. So I just wanted to display them in all their beauty, but also in their agony as well. If we can't relate to the plight of something that we care about a great deal, we can't relate to the plight of anything, basically. But here we've got more horizontal action going on, and I think that's an interesting comparison too.
It is the volume of these fish, and they truly are beautiful. They have this surface and this gold quality that, of course, makes them be so precious, but all moving and struggling. These fish out of water, and they're really, really wonderful. I think. Love this piece. And your secret ingredient was nail polish.
Yes, I use that pretty often on my ceramics because it has an interesting quality, and also I think of it as pollution.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I went searching for some bottles once in a creek bed, and I found a lot of nail polish bottles. And I thought, well, these probably weren't completely empty when they were thrown in here.
Yeah. Uh,
So,
um,
and it's adornment too.
making good use. But I love how they come up on the wall, and they're for scale.
Yes.
And these are the pieces that are at Chris Worley right now, so
Yes.
you can see them. Please do. All right, now this is fun.
So, so here I am with this show trying to address, what my fears as well as other people's fears are about the rise of artificial intelligence and humans being replaced by technology. Um, I was thinking about the ideal child, the perfect child. That's what her title is, and that people might be so cold and distant that they might be willing to have a robotic child instead of a real flesh and blood child that made an actual mess and she couldn't turn off when you wanted to. So you can turn her on and off with a remote, and she blows bubbles only when you want her to. And it's sort of the comparison of a childish joy with um, sort of the fully controlled form of a robot, because the robot's not going to experience pleasure. Um, in the early days of artificial intelligence, they claimed that desire was something that would not be a factor, that they would not experience desire, they would not have wants of their own. I think you could argue against that. I mean, if it's programmed to demand more power, demand another battery, then that is in some ways a form of desire. So I'm interested in exploring that theme some more.
We, we're going to segue and look at her again, but we'll look at this next object, which is again, really wonderful. Tell me about it, Celia, and why
Yeah.
you picked this
Yeah,
one.
this-
Again, I was really glad you did.
Yeah, right. And this is from the 8th century, which is truly remarkable. It's a Japanese jikagu mask, and it was worn by performers to inject a note of comic relief into the lengthy rituals of Buddhism. So I think in that regard, giving an audience a chance to relax and um, enjoy some humor. I think that it represents a kind of controlled wilding, released from expected behavior, sort of like Mardi Gras or Carnival. Um, and I think that it also relates to the tension between this sort of creative primal and this destructive primal, which was also Moreau's territory. So um, I like to compare that one to Moreau's thinking as well.
Mhm.
So when I compare this to the perfect child, I'm considering the controlling the spontaneity of childhood and suppressing the individual childish needs in service to the owner of the robot, which also relates to the uses of the robot in Metropolis.
These are we'll look at the perfect child before we move on. Also similar to the way that you work this kind of preciousness again, of this object, because it's made out of lacquer and then painted, so sort of many layers of it, and also accompanied by music. Apparently, in these, as you said, these performances that would be sort of intermissions in the very solemn rituals during the time. So it's really interesting to think about these alongside.
Yeah, and it apparently once had tufts of hair, and I've applied hair to the robot as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking back also to yeah, your love machine. So here we see the scale. And again, this is at Chris Worley right now, so you can see it. And here, little blowing bubbles. And how did you get her to blow so many bubbles? It's really great.
I actually use a child's toy. It's a little bubble shooter thing, and then we rigged it up with a remote. So it's a fragile situation. It's a fragile setup, but we managed to keep it working. It's required some effort to keep going, but yeah, it required a lot of thought and pre-planning to get the bubbles to work the way that I wanted them to.
I can imagine, not to say nothing of just deciding about the proportions in body and surface of the child, and it's really, really wonderful. And I love her sort of golden eyelashes and brows with her hair. She's really wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of a combination of robot and idol. So this guy probably relates even more directly to the mask. It's that beastly part of ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge. And we're creating artificial intelligence by using social media to train it. So it will just continue to reflect that beast that's within us. And we'll just continue to use technology to do what we have always done. So he's a robot. He's just a mouth, and that's all he does. Just constant chomping.
So scale.
Yeah.
And whoops. Try that again. We've got another.
So he's pretty random. He starts and stops.
He really does have a life of his own. Here it comes.
Yeah. Yeah, he does. He has a mind of his own. And he's triggered by I can't think of what I want to say now. When you approach him, that's what causes him to come on.
So it has like a motion sensor or something. Yeah. He's wonderful. And another beast, the deep.
And so I had been making these fur things like back in the 90s. I made several of these mask-like creations with lots of eyes. So I thought of this particular one as a representation of the collective id. And here again, it's thinking about the beastly aspect and the fact that civilization is a thin veneer. And I think we have seen that recently, that it truly is a very thin veneer, and it's very fragile. And so it's a perception of our uncivilized selves, but also, and going back to the original mask-like faces that I made, it relates to the idea of animism the ancient belief that everything has a spirit, and the idea that nature perceives us and can act for or against us and is never under our control, but requires our deference and respect. So that's what I would like to express um, about this piece. And it's sort of very much deeper meaning. We're part of nature and we just don't want to acknowledge it.
Mhm. And ending a little closer. I had told Celia I like ending with the eyes because they look like our artist's eye, which was the idea for it. There is so much more, Celia, that I would love to hear from you, and I can't thank you enough for agreeing to participate in this in this program. You have I've truly enjoyed getting to know you and to look at your art, and I hope everyone can come out and enjoy your show too if they have the time and can get over to Dallas, but also just keep up with you and the things that I know that you'll be doing in the future, all of that. So shall we look and see if there are some questions? We've got a couple of minutes, I think, that we can look. Yeah, we've got some comments about loving the juxtapositions and hearing Celia's observations, and seeing it in the context of the older art. And that's always set a shot in the arm for us to be able to see things in other ways, but certainly in the way that you approach art in a very and when I put it into words, it's not as eloquent as you do, but working with some of these themes and this whole idea of universal themes and mythologies that speak so deeply to us, and things that can be uncomfortable too. That somehow you make it go down because they're so beautiful and we want to hold them or pet them or touch them or play with them. But what I've found is that I really love spending time, with the work, and I'll think of something, later on, whether it's intended or not. It taps into something, and I think that's an indication of how very deeply you are thinking about things as you create all of this, and enjoying the making as well. So let me see if we've got one more. Yeah. There was a question about, I'm going to stop our share so you can see us again, about how you source your bone, Celia.
Oh, yeah, they're from cattle that have died naturally. I live in an area where there are a lot of cattle ranches, and people bring them to me. So no animals were slaughtered in the production of this creation. No, they're totally dead naturally, and they've been lying out in the sun for a long time, so they're clean. I don't deal with the ones that still have flesh on them unless it's just a very minor amount. And I sanitize them with hydrogen peroxide by soaking them for several days before I even start to carve them. So it's pristine and it's safe. And I have made use of something that would eventually decay and go away.
There are more bone pieces in the show and others earlier that are, these castle-like forms and so on. And the way that you've worked that material is as you said, the sheen, the polish, and so on. Really, really beautiful. It's some of my favorite works. And I was asking about the turtle. He died a natural death too. So it's okay.
I found him. He was he was gone. So yeah, it's I try not to create any more damage than I can help.
And you've worked with also a lot of precious materials and lapis lazuli and good links and you know, again, when spending time with your art, I can see how you get there, you know, sometimes and that in the end the objects are so very beautiful as well. Well, I want to thank everyone for, I think we've gone to most of the questions, for joining us today. And I hope you can join us for our next online Articide talk. It will be June 12th, again, a Saturday at 11 o'clock with Darren Waterston, moderated by George Shackelford. And we're looking forward when we can all be back in the galleries and hope to see you there. So thanks again, Celia, and wishing everyone a wonderful weekend.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.